There's no churches today that are doing what they did in 1825 that are still around. They've had to change. The message hasn't changed. The gospel hasn't changed, but how they do church in those eras. So I often say to church leaders who say, "Hey, we're thinking about change. What do you think?" And I'm like, "What alternative do you have?" Because you just mentioned it. If you don't change a church, eventually, it will die.
I love that music because when I hear that music, I know that it's time for Pastor to Pastor. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Dave Stone. Thank you for being a part of this episode, and I know you're going to be blessed by it. Hey, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to subscribe to Pastor, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram at Pastor to Pastor Podcast. On YouTube, you can follow us on the Focused Pastor channel. And hey, if this conversation blesses you, please share it with another pastor or ministry leader in your life. We got a lot of great resources from past episodes, some incredible conversations we've had. We also have an entire episode devoted to funerals, also one devoted to weddings in case you're new to ministry, or if you just would like some fresh ideas of some things that you can work into a funeral or a wedding. But before we jump in today and I tell you about our guest, let me encourage you to go watch a new documentary from Focus on the Family and the Colson Center. It's called Truth Rising. And let me tell you, you're going to love it. It's been out for several weeks now. Our Bible study group on Wednesday nights, they just watched it. And let me tell you, the response that we got was powerful. My Bible study group has couples in their 20s and in their 30s. And let me just tell you, it hits right where our culture is today. So check that out. Go to truthrising.com. You can watch the film for free, or you can just click on the link in the show notes. Well, our guest today is Gene Appel from Anaheim, California at the Eastside Christian Church. You've heard me say on this podcast numerous times how important it is to have some close friends in ministry, people that you can go to when you're going through a difficult time. I could count on one hand the people that I call when I am in the depths of the valley. And Gene Appel is one of those guys. Gene has spent more than 4 decades pastoring churches in Illinois, in Las Vegas, and in California. But his calling to the pastorate came at a very young age. And since that calling, he could be described as an architect, as a faithful change agent, and as a humble servant. And you're going to see all of those things play out as you listen to him and watch this podcast today. When I think of Gene Appel, I think of humility, of intentionality. And God has used him in my life in an incredible way. And I know that this conversation on how to change churches is going to be something that's going to be very important for you in your ministry. So let's enjoy this conversation with Gene Appel. Gene Appel, welcome. I have looked forward to this day for a long time. Thank you so much for joining us, my friend.
Man, I love what you're doing with Pastor to Pastor, Dave, and it's an honor to be a part of this conversation today with a friend.
Yeah, you're one of my best friends in life, and we go back probably over 3 decades of friendship, and God really blessed me when he brought you into my life. And we have a lot of things in common. We both were PKs and grew up in ministry homes. We got a lot of listeners who have grown up in ministry homes as well. Tell me a little bit about your experience and your parents.
Yeah, well, it's really cool that, even our dads knew each other.
I know.
And I love that long time kind of connection that's there. I grew up, a lot of kids grow up playing house, playing doctor. We grew up at our house playing church. And, I had 3 older sisters that sometimes would do like a worship team in the living room, and I had a brother pray, and I'd give a sermon, and we'd hit mom or dad 4 or 5 times with the offering bucket before they realized. Well, it was a very profitable experience for us growing up, but my dad, man, he was the best. He was just the real deal. And, a lot of kids resent growing up as a pastor's kid. I didn't, because the same guy who lived at our house was the same guy that people saw in public, and he really marked my life and in so many good ways. And I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and when I was 14 years old, we were out fishing one day, my dad and my grandfather. Came back from that fishing trip in northern Minnesota, where our family has vacationed my entire life, and I still do today. And Dad wasn't feeling well, and found out he had had a massive heart attack. Had to take him to the local hospital, and 4 days later, they had to transport him from that local hospital in the small town of Park Rapids, Minnesota, to the bigger hospital in Fargo, North Dakota. And so all the family went to Fargo to wait for the car and for my dad's ambulance to arrive, and except my brother Mike and I, we went back to our family cabin because we had to pack some stuff for all the family. Then we were going to join him in Fargo. And I'll never forget being at the cabin, and I see a familiar car drive up the road, and it was my dad's best friend. And he got out, he put one arm around me and one arm around my brother Mike, and he said, "Boys, I've got some good news and some bad news for you." He said, "Good news is your dad's gone to heaven today. And the bad news is he isn't with us any longer." And so at 14 years of age, just kind of losing my hero, my mentor, just a great, great man. And I remember like a few hours after his death, our family had all gathered back at our cabin, and we were preparing to do the 700-mile drive back to Illinois and get ready for his funeral and all the arrangements, that associated with that. And it's just been a few hours, it's really fresh. The grief is fresh. And my mom asked me if I would go down the road. There was a little resort just about a half mile away where over the course of the summer we would buy milk and coffee and, some light groceries. And they would actually keep a tab. Can you imagine that? They would keep a tab and we would pay it off at the end of the summer.
Mayberry.
Yeah, for sure. And so she gave me a wad of cash, asked me if I'd go down and pay off that bill. And I said, sure. So I'm walking down that road, and I still visit this place every year. It was a gravel road with pine trees on each side. And I just remember everything about that walk in vivid detail. I remember what I was wearing. I had on a pair of plaid bell bottoms with cuffs, about 3 inches big, and a maroon colored t-shirt. I was only 14 years old, but I had a pretty good fashion sense about myself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but I felt like God spoke to me that day, and it wasn't an audible voice, but I just had the overwhelming impression, and still it's as real today as it was, 51 years ago. I just sensed God saying, "Hey, Gene, what happened to your dad today is going to happen to every person on the face of the earth. One day is going to be their last day on this planet. And there's only one thing that matters on that day. Did they know my son, and had they experienced the power of amazing grace?" And fortunately I knew where my dad was and that he had experienced that. But I just sensed God saying that day, if you'll put your hand in my hand, if you'll trust your life with me, I'm going to use your life to help people get ready for their last day and to live every day between now and then in my power and grace. It's still powerful to me when I think about that, and, I get choked up. But that was, what seemingly was the worst event in my life, became, kind of that even now moment where God just moved, and the whole trajectory of my life got defined that day. And, I look back, that's the starting point. I'm really grateful for a mom and a dad who both pointed me to Jesus and lived out that example for me.
Well, so many times those painful experiences are those times when we grow, and we wouldn't wish them on anybody else, and yet God works out of those. I think back to Jack Graham, a former guest that we had on here, and he told a story about his father passing away. It was a pretty rough story of his dad being murdered, and yet Jack talked about being in a hospital chapel and just praying and really feeling that call from the Lord that God was going to use him. And he actually really released his desire for revenge in that hospital chapel. I know incredible things happen sometimes in the lowest and most painful moments of our lives. And everyone who's listening is a Christian leader. We go through ups and downs, whether it's the loss of a loved one or a health diagnosis or being reorganized and cut out of a church staff, whatever it might look like. We've all gone through pain, and I love the fact that you used that painful time to be one that really brought you closer to the Lord, and it actually propelled you to say, I want to be used like my dad was used. I never got to meet your dad, but your dad was someone who was close to my dad, and my dad told me plenty of great things about Leon Appel, and I know how proud he would be of you. One of the things that you really are strong at, and I've heard you speak on this, lecture on it, teach on it at conferences and workshops, and I think it's one of the gifts that God has given you is how to lead through change. And I know there are a lot of churches who struggle in this particular area, and yet you've done a really good job of capturing and really quantifying how it is that there's some steps and some things that can take place. I've even heard at times when you have likened it to gardening and how it is that there are different things that take place. But would you talk with us a little bit about how it is that churches can change and must change? Because really the church that doesn't change eventually will die. And I'd love to hear just you expound on that a little bit more.
Well, you've hit it exactly. There's no churches today that are doing what they did in 1825 that are still around. They've had to change. The message hasn't changed. The gospel hasn't changed, but how they do church in those eras. So I often say to church leaders who say, "Hey, we're thinking about change. What do you think?" And I'm like, "What alternative do you have?" Because you just mentioned it. If you don't change, a church eventually, it will die. And the gospel is all about change. The gospel is all about newness. So we're in the change business, is what God has called us to. And I've kind of, as you look at local churches and the gospel expression, it always just seems to me like churches, just to stay relevant, have to reinvent themselves every 5 years or so, and have to dramatically reinvent themselves probably every 10 to 15 years. Because times change, the world changes, and if we want to be relevant, we've got to change. I mean, the statistics, 10,000 churches in North America this year are going to close their doors. They're going to sing their last song, say their last prayer for the last time. And so I've been burdened about leading churches like that through change because, for one, it's just good stewardship. There's existing churches, there's church buildings, there's church facilities and parking lots, and there's people that if they could be re-envisioned, remobilized, I mean, for the future, that's just such a great thing. So, you mentioned a gardener, or a farmer planting seed, a gardener planting seed. That's how I think about change. You have to lead through 4 phases. There's the first phase, if you're going to plant the seed, is you got to prepare the soil. And then the second phase, once the soil's prepared, then you plant the seed. And then the third phase is once it's planted, you got to cultivate, water, and fertilize. There might be some weeds to pull. And then fourth is eventually the harvest. But what I see that really sidetracks a lot of church leaders that make a what could be a positive change process go bad. They love the second and the fourth stage. They love to plant the new vision, the seed of the new, and they love to experience the harvest. But really the hard work and the pastoral work and where you win or lose is going to be in phase 1 and 3 when you're preparing the soil, letting a church get ready for change. And then third, once you've implemented, how do we cultivate it? How do we water it? How do we keep moving forward?
Yeah, so there's that excitement that comes in 2 and 4, of the newness, the freshness, and then counting the numbers or pointing out and saying, see, it worked, and God's at work here. But boy, you're exactly right. 1 and 3 is really where it's at, because you can't have 2 and 4 without 1 and 3.
Right. You know, when I came to I've been serving at Eastside Church in Anaheim, California for 17 years now. And when I came to the church 17 years ago this fall, the church had been in a multi-year decline. And, this is a church that I loved. I had interned at this church when I was 20 years old. And at that time, the church was rocking and going and blowing. But a lot of years had passed, and it had kind of lost sight of what's the ultimate purpose of why we exist. And, we spent, 9 months, just kind of preparing the soil, getting the right people in conversations. This was in 2008. And so our prayer was, God, what do you want our church to look like in 2012? And the reason we kind of put a 4-year horizon out there was we knew that 2012 would be the church's 50th anniversary year. And we thought, what if when the church turns 50, most churches at 50, the truth is their best days are behind them. There's certainly a number of exceptions to that, but for many churches, that's true. And we said, wouldn't it be something if when we turned 50, that we didn't have the sense that our best days were behind us, but our best days are ahead of us? And so that kind of guided that question that put us on conversations with church members, with board members, with staff members, to kind of take about 9 months I would say that was all preparing the soil for really the vision and direction that the church has taken really over the last 17 years, and that's continued to evolve and shape to the times that we're in.
I'm going to jump back to prepare the soil, just as far as give me practical advice on, if I'm a Christian leader, I'm listening to this, okay, I'm going to be making some type of change, or I'm recommending that the elders buy into this change that I'm trying to suggest, or I'm a team member along the staff, and this is something that we want to have as an initiative. What are some practical ways of really preparing the soil? How can you do that? Let's say they're thinking about maybe a multi-site campus, or maybe they're thinking about a new program, or killing one program that hasn't done well and starting another one. What does preparing the soil look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And part of preparing the soil is you've got to raise urgency. And, a lot of people don't realize there's a problem. And so until they have the quantifiable data that says, hey, we're losing our young people, or, we've not seen hardly any people come to Christ in a period of time, or our numbers of baptisms are down, dramatically over the last 2 to 5 years from what they were before. People aren't open to change if they don't feel any urgency. And so we got to have some quantifiable data and stories to be able to tell, hey, here's what's happening in our church. Good. Like when I came to Eastside, some of the things we were dealing with at the time is that we'd become a predominantly gray-haired church. Nothing wrong with gray hair. I've got my share. But, if you roll that videotape ahead 10 years, where's the church going to be if there's not an influx of the next generation? Yeah. What are we going to do to reach our grandchildren and our great grandchildren and beyond that? So you've got to have some urgency to that, and then you got to get the right people having conversations. So like when I came to Eastside again 17 years ago, there was a popular book at the time, still a great book that I highly recommend, by Eric Geiger and Tom Rainier on Simple Church. And we got all of our leaders reading it, and we've got all of our staff and board members, and we formed a strategic planning team that had some staff members on it, a board member on it, some people from the congregation on it. And we just started reading and dreaming about, what is God calling us to, and clarifying that vision and mission. And so, there was about 7 months of kind of determining, we didn't really come up with anything new. I think we just came back reinventing Acts chapter 2. And we said, we dream of being a church that's transforming homes and our community and world as we do 3 things: as we pursue God, build community, and unleash compassion. And those things really became the focus of what we wanted to do: pursue God, build community, unleash compassion. And I always say it became our start doing list and our stop doing list, as we started to think about, hey, some of the different programs and things, how does that fit into this mission? And is there a place for it in the mission moving forward?
I love what you said about the gray hair. Nothing wrong with the gray haired church, but if you don't continue to tweak and reinvent and go back to the simplicity of the gospel and the mission, then you're going to struggle. What was that old poem? Methods are many, principles are few. Methods always change, but principles never do.
Yeah, for sure.
And you stay that course. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it like this. He said, the righteous person lives for the next generation. And that's one of the things that I love about you, Gene, is you always have a young staff. Your staff, whenever I've been at Eastside, they breathe life into me, because it's not a gray-haired room of lead staff. It's a little bit of everything. And you'll have men, you'll have women, you'll have young, you'll have middle-aged, you'll have older. And I think that's a beautiful picture of what the church is, and that's what continues to attract, so that it doesn't just become, a gray-haired church.
Yeah.
I was listening as you were talking about the soil, and you were talking about seeing things that need to be changed. Lots of times a staff will notice those things before the church does. And lots of times a staff will notice those things before the elders do. I remember when we felt like we were out of space at a church where I was serving at Southeast in Louisville, and all of our staff, we put this big presentation together. Senior pastor presented it to the elders and why we needed more room and that we were going to have to build a larger facility. And the elders were like, "Oh, no, I think we're all right for a while. And but thanks so much for bringing this to our attention." And the wind was out of our sails, Gene, because the staff, we saw it, we were experiencing it, we were feeling it. And the only thing that came out of that night, other than all of us being down, was the fact that the elders said, you know what, we're going to put together a long-term planning committee. And so they put a long-term planning committee together from the eldership. And 3 months later, the long-term planning committee came and they made a report, and they started the report this way, saying, first of all, we don't want to call this a long-term planning committee anymore. We'd like to call it the short-term crisis committee. And they said, we've got a problem. And they basically went through everything that
you had gone through,
that the senior pastor had gone through the 3 months before.
Sure.
And all the elders nodded. And all of a sudden we were on this pathway to looking for property. And I remember the two of us talking as we walked away. And I said, what happened tonight? And it was an astute observation, as the senior pastor said, well, before it was our idea, but now it's their idea.
Yeah.
And so they've embraced it.
Yeah. And that's what it takes. I learned that lesson early on when I was an intern at Eastside, many moons ago. And my mentor at the time, and just such an influence on my life, was a man named Ben Merrill, who you knew and God used in some really powerful ways. And I remember during my internship, I go to lunch with Ben one day, and he brings an elder who's the chairman of their missions committee, and Ben had some ideas about some new things they ought to be doing in missions. And it was with, the guy's name was Sheldon Welch. And so that was pretty good. So then I got to go to the next elders meeting. I'm sitting with Ben, and all of a sudden Sheldon gets up and starts casting vision to the rest of the elders, hey, here's some new ideas for mission, guys. What do you think? And they kind of went around the room, and everybody was like, good idea, Sheldon, good idea, good idea. And then finally somebody said, Ben, what do you think? He said, I think Sheldon's got a pretty good idea there. I can support it. But it's the exactly thing, it was their, it was just their idea. And it takes some time too. And I think a lot of times, we're just not patient while that process happens. Like you guys were ready to go with that initial presentation, and it wasn't, you could have gotten adversarial with the board at that point. Oh, they just don't get it. They don't, of course it was discouraging, but you gave them some time, you gave them some space. And once they embraced it, you were able to move further and faster than you would have if you without their full embrace of it.
I don't want you to miss that phrase, everybody. Further and faster. Because now they had embraced it. They'd seen the data, but now it had been inculcated into their own life and their own experience as they sought data and did their own investigation. I love that. Yeah. Further and faster. And you've gone through a lot of different changes, and you've led in dynamic churches in Vegas, in Illinois, and at Eastside. What you are doing and what God's doing at Eastside and Anaheim right now. I don't know of a church that has done such a good job of coming alongside of smaller churches, even in different states. Your multi-site campuses are different than most people when you hear the multi-site campus. And I'd love for you just to speak to that a little bit, because it's really been a kingdom move. And by that, I just mean that God has taken a lot of different type churches, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, whether it's smaller, whether it's dying, whether it's plateaued. Could you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, we live in a part of the country where property is $6 million an acre. And so we knew that if we were to, continue to reach people, we couldn't do it just by buying property. It's kind of fiscally unattainable for us. But we're burdened by the fact that there are so many churches that are struggling or, about to close their doors or have closed their doors. And I can tell you a couple quick stories. There was a church in Bellflower, California. That's in Los Angeles County, which is, you've heard the movie Straight Outta Compton. Bellflower is literally straight out of Compton. You drive from Compton into Bellflower. And the first Christian church in Bellflower had existed there for 94 years and had decided to close its doors. They were down to 30 people. None of the 30 people still lived in the community. And they decided to close the doors. And they approached us and they said, if we gave you this building, would you do something great for God in the next 90 years here? Wow. And, I just thought, what humility and courage that took for those people to make a decision like that. A lot of church leaders aren't willing to make that decision. And we didn't have any people in Bellflower, California, but we found a great campus pastor who would reflect the community that they lived in. And we got some people from our Anaheim campus who said, hey, we'll go serve for 6 months. And man, that thing is growing and thriving today. This church that had closed its doors, this was 6 years ago, last weekend, had almost 800 in attendance. They started their 4th weekend service. And
are you serious? Gene, I had no idea.
It's just an amazing thing. We had a similar thing happen in Park Rapids, Minnesota, which is a little town of about 4,000 people in northern Minnesota. It's near a place where my family has vacationed all of our life. And I knew a pastor there that reached out to me. He planted a church when he was 70 years old. You got to love that, right? A pastor planted a church when he was 70 years old. And when he was 78, he approached me. And he said, God has spoken, and we're to be a campus of Eastside in the future. And I, with great faith and vision, said, well, God hasn't spoken to me. That just seemed crazy.
How far is that from Anaheim? 1,200 miles? Gosh, what is it?
No, it's like 1,800 miles from Anaheim. And, man, we looked it over and our heart said yes, our head said no, but God again brought us just a great campus pastor who would love that area. And we started literally with 25 people in their 70s. They had 0 children in the church. We hired a campus pastor. He had 4 children under the age of 5. So we had a children's ministry, from the get-go. And God has just moved in that community. Last weekend, they had 785 people in church and thriving children's and student ministries. This is in a town of 4,000 people. And the church sits 7 miles outside of town. It's in a rural setting. The facility does. And so it's just, I have such a heart to see churches of all sizes in all settings thrive. And so, at Eastside, we've got a campus in rural Minnesota. We got a campus in urban Los Angeles County, California. We've got campuses in and we got a campus in Vegas.
Vegas, I was going to say, yeah.
Of all places. We've got I call it the Wild West of Redlands, California, which is an area called the Inland Empire, and so churches in different settings. But the common thread that all those campuses have in common is they were dying, struggling, or dead, and God has done a new thing. And man, it's fulfilling and gratifying to see. When people who were a part of these churches see their grandchildren come into faith and being baptized, it brings tears to their eyes, and you're just excited about what the next chapter holds for them.
And what a beautiful example it is when you see these people in their 70s who embrace change, and they might not always welcome it, but they stomach it because of the fact that their kids or their grandkids are coming to Christ, and they know that that's more important than whether it's their preference or it's their style or it's the way that they would do church. I was at one of the campuses of the church where I served for a number of years here in Louisville, and it's actually the mother church of Southeast Christian. And they were dying in an area that, like you just described, is close to Churchill Downs. And they came to us. And so now the mother church has become a daughter church. I don't know if that makes it a grand. Yeah. I can't figure it out. But
that's awesome.
In Kentucky, our family trees are a little bit crazy anyway. We're not sure how they fork as it is. But I went and visited that campus with my wife about 9 months ago, and I sat in this old sanctuary where I had actually spoken when I was back a youth minister years ago when it was a different church. Sure. And I can't tell you what it was like to see 4 women, white-haired, all between the ages of 70 and 85, and they were in the third row. They were surrounded by college and young adults all around them, and they sang their hearts out. You would have thought they were singing How Great Thou Art or Amazing Grace. But they put their hands up. I actually snapped a picture of it because it ripped my heart out in such a positive way to say those people are here because they love the church and they love Jesus and they love what's going on. The service couldn't end quick enough for me to make a beeline to them and just give each of them a hug and to thank them for the way that they are building the kingdom just through a positive attitude when things are done differently than they probably would do.
Yeah. And I think deep down that people all want that. I've noticed other than the campus in Bellflower that had closed its doors and we really started with nothing there, but all our other campuses, even though they were small and dying, we've retained over 90% of the people who were originally there before, the kind of the new chapter, the reinvention. Yeah, it's quite, and again, it's like those women that you just described. It's people looking back and saying, oh, in some ways, while it's not the style maybe they're used to, people would say, this is what I always dreamed and prayed would happen in our church.
Yeah. There's something that happens when the focus is on Jesus. The Bible says, Jesus says, if I be lifted up, will draw all people unto me. And as churches lift up Christ, people do come to it. Now, I know we have Christian leaders who are listening to this and they're saying, okay, give me a word as a Christian leader. What are some things that I need to be careful of? I've heard you talk about, that 1/3 of pastors actually finish well. And so we have a lot of people who really want to finish well, and they don't want to become a statistic. And I've heard you talk about just some important qualities. God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble is a mantra that I've heard you speak to pastors about. What are some words of encouragement that you would give to those who are in Christian leadership so that they would, in their 20s, not just look to finish well, but that right now they would say, I want to be used by God. I want to be a person who strengthens the faith of those around me and who is growing spiritually myself.
Yeah. Years ago, when I was in my 20s, I read Gordon MacDonald's book, Ordering Your Private World, and it became one of the most important books, really, that defining books. It probably was just the right book at the right time in my life. And he talks in that book about how we have an interior world and an exterior world. And, our exterior world is only as strong as our interior world. And, so a lot of times when we see a pastor that burns out or flames out or, disqualifies himself from ministry, and it seemed like, oh, that happened suddenly. It didn't happen suddenly. It was because they didn't give the interior world attention. It's like a sinkhole in a ground. I think Gordon MacDonald uses that as a word picture. Like someday, a sinkhole appears in Florida and a house falls in the ground, or a car falls in, and it seems like it happened suddenly, but it wasn't sudden. It had been eroding over time, and that, I think, really helped me at a formative time in my life. I'm in my mid-20s, and say, I've got to, I want to develop the interior world so that I can last for the long haul, so that I can be in this for the long haul, and hopefully by God's grace, day at a time. So, I've noticed pastors that make it for the long haul really give attention to their interior world, and the habits and the spiritual practices, the disciplines that nobody else sees, nobody else is even going to measure you by. That's not going to be part of the success that's celebrated about your ministry, but it is the sustaining power for so many people. I was recently with a group of pastors, and it was interesting, in this particular group that has been gathering for about 17 years or so, you're familiar with it because you started the group, is not one of them has had a bad ending. And we've seen a number of them reach retirement years and transitions. And, it was just kind of like, wow, of all, we see so many bad endings today. What is it about this group that they're batting 1,000 and ending well right now? By God's grace, batting 1,000, And I think there were different factors about that, but one of them is, I think all of them have, true accountability in their life. They have accountability with church boards, and they actually have a board that can fire them. And that's not a bad thing. And also I noticed about this group, oozing humility, like in that particular group, there's one guy who leads one of the largest churches in the nation. There's another guy who, has sold millions of books, and yet they just show up with a spirit to learn and serve, and they just ooze with humility. And I think when they ooze humility like that, other pastors and leaders catch it and say, I need that in my life too. And I think that's why it's healthy for us to be around other examples and peers in ministry, to keep us on track. They inspire us.
Do you have any suggestions for somebody might be listening to this and say, well, I agree with everything you just said. I would love to have some Christian friendships of some people who serve in ministry that maybe would understand some of the pressures and pain that I go through at times. What would you say to that person who Satan is pulling them toward loneliness and isolation? How would you encourage them to actually find some friends and some people that they can have accountability with, and that they can even talk ministry with?
Well, I think it can come in two directions. I think one is sometimes people seek you out and maybe invite you into an opportunity. Hey, we're getting this group together, or this cohort together, or this, it can happen that way. Or the opposite way is you initiate it, and you reach out to a few people and say, hey, I just got this idea. I've got a buddy who did that with 3 friends years ago, and they get together twice a year and stay in touch by text, and they live in different parts of the country, but they're doing life together. And they began, I don't know, probably 15, 20 years ago with the idea we want to finish well together someday, and they're helping each other across the finish line. So I would just, who's 3 or 4 or 5 people that you respect, that you admire, and that, think they might be interested in, you're dealing with similar challenges. I think that's an important thing, to have peers, that are
Yeah.
dealing with the stage of ministry that I'm at, the stage of life that I'm at, the challenges I'm kind of facing in ministry. Who are some other people dealing with those same things? And I found that to be one of the greatest gifts in my life, is to have friends like that.
There's a lot of things that I think you excel at, but when I talk about Gene Appel, I talk about your intentionality, your leadership skills. You have such a foresight when I think of leadership issues and how you process and how you think things through and how you gather different information from other people and bounce things off of others. But one thing that always stands out to me, and it has for all 30 plus years that we've been friends, is your love for evangelism. And I know that that's a gifting that some people have, is that gift of evangelism, but it's always been at the forefront of your mind and of your heart. And it's been in every one of your ministries. I think back to in Illinois, stories that you would tell and how God used you in a variety of different ways and gave you a mouthpiece. You even would be on the news giving a commentary, like once a week, a 1-minute commentary on some subject. I don't know how those things came about, but it was always designed to reach people who were far from God. And you served at Vegas and Anaheim. Share some thoughts or some stories about how it is that God has shaped that evangelistic heart that you have.
Great question. I think a part of it, a big part of it goes back to that calling story that I started with today, when God reached down and I really sensed him saying, I want to use your life to help people get ready for their last day. So that just kind of shaped everything. I grew up in the Midwest, kind of in Bible Belt church culture. And I was 25 years old when God called me to Vegas to pastor Central Christian Church there. And, I was so young, I could barely shave. And, in the setting that I grew up in kind of Midwest, small town, like certainly I saw the gospel change lives, but in Vegas, I saw the gospel dramatically change lives. People, from all walks of life, dealing with all kinds of complex issues. We had this eclectic neighborhood. We had a Mormon family that lived behind us. We had a Hindu family on one side of us. We had a Jewish family across the street from us, and just your basic Las Vegas heathen family on the other side of us.
It sounds like
he
a
was
joke
an
you're setting
attorney.
up.
Yeah, I know.
I'm waiting for the rabbi to, yeah.
He was, our heathen neighbors were, he was an attorney, and she was a topless dancer in a Vegas show. And, our kids played with their kids every day. And so we started praying, God, use us somehow to build a bridge to all these eclectic neighbors around us. And we ended up getting kind of especially close with the Jewish family across the street and the heathens next door, because we had kids all the same age, and they all kind of interacted with each other. They'd go on vacation. We'd get their mail for them, et cetera. They'd have birthday parties. We'd go over to the topless dancer's house for birthday parties. There were a lot of surgically enhanced people there. I can tell you that, just to kind of give you a sense of the setting. But we had a burden for these people, and Barbara and I just started praying, and we kind of believed that, gosh, it may be 5 years, this is going to be a long journey before we even get them in a church. And after about a year of living in that neighborhood, 9/11 happened. And those who are old enough to remember 9/11 remember that that following Sunday after that horrible event, churches were packed all across the country because there was nothing else to do. Sporting events were canceled. There were no flights, it was eerily silent in the skies. And I remember after the 9:00 service that morning, as I was had slipped into my office to kind of get my notes together for the next service, and my wife Barbara walks in and she's in tears and she goes, "You'll never guess who I just sat with." And I said, "Who?" And she said, "The names of our heathen neighbors next door." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Yeah." She goes, "I was just walking in the door today. We happened to be walking in at the same time. We sat together. And what we didn't know, we hadn't talked to them for a few days, was that the best man in their wedding had been killed in the collapse of the World Trade Center tower in New York City. And they were hurting and they reached out. And that morning I had actually asked people to stand who had been personally affected by, the losses in DC or Pennsylvania or New York. And here they are standing, and Barbara's got her hands on them, praying for them. She's crying, they're crying. And God used that tragedy, and I just couldn't believe it, to plant seeds in their life. And then after the 11 o'clock service, I'm making my way through the hallways trying to, just touch and encourage as many people as I could. And all of a sudden I look down the hall, and it's my Jewish neighbor from across the street coming at me. And I'm like, what is going on? And, she came up. I remember she had tears in her eyes and gave me a big bear hug and just said, "Oh, Gene, you have no idea what being here today has meant to me." And I just, watched God use that horrible time in our nation and world to be a spiritual turning point in the lives of people that that we really cared about. And I say that because, Dave, unlike you, I don't have the gift of evangelism. I know you have the spiritual gift. I believe that, but I have a heart for lost people, and so I tend to be kind of in the relational world. There's a guy who's been cutting my hair for 8 years, and we're so far from God. I mean, and it took 6 years to get him into church. And I just had a text from him the other day, and he goes, "Thanks for never giving up on me when I was making all kinds of bad choices, and thanks for loving me and leading me to Jesus," and is what he said. And I was crying reading the note. That's kind of my personal style. But then I try to, in my leadership style, I want to engage the church so that the whole church has a heart like that for people, and that we're doing the kinds of initiatives and preaching and programs and ministries that can reach our community and those who are far from God, and that will be helpful to us in the people we're trying to reach.
Well, I disagree with you, because I do think you have the gift of evangelism. You go about it, and we go about it in different ways, but I love the relational aspect. I love your example of, you got to be in it for the long haul with these neighbors, with the person where you get your haircut, with your barista, whoever it might be. I don't think I'll have the opportunity to have the long haul relationship with the people who cut my hair, because in 6 years... Yeah. Okay. Enough said, especially for those of you who are watching on YouTube right now and can see that the time is fast approaching. It's going to have to be more of a style of reaching them in 1 year, I think, Gene, for me. Wrap us up. This has been so rich. I'd like you just to speak to the hearts of those Christian leaders who are listening, who are in the good fight right now. They're serving. They might be a volunteer. They might be on a ministry team as a staff person. Maybe they're an elder or deacon. We have a lot of elders who listen to this podcast. I want you to help them understand why it's important what they do, because I know Satan chips away saying, "Oh, you could be doing something else. You could be making more money doing something else." Will you let them know what those eternal implications are, and why it is that it's so important that they let God use them in service to Him?
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so grateful for all those people you just described and what they're doing in the kingdom, for all you pastors, leaders, volunteers, board members. I'm so thankful for you. I keep a 22 caliber bullet in the top drawer of my desk, and you say, well, that's an unusual thing to keep in your desk. And it is an unusual thing. There's a story behind it.
Yes, please tell us what the story is. You've got my attention.
Okay. So one Sunday, a number of years ago, after we'd been going through a lot of changes and stuff, this was happened in Vegas, the time that I was leading there. A guy comes up to me after the service. I think he was about 27 years old, redheaded guy, and he has this 22 caliber bullet in his hand. And he goes, "Here, Gene, I want you to have this." And I'm like, I didn't know what that meant. Nobody had ever handed me a bullet after I preached a sermon before, And he said, "I want you to have this." And then he went on to explain. He said, "I was going to put that in my head this week. He said, but what happened here today was incredible. And I believe maybe through God's power, there's hope for somebody like me. There's hope for somebody like me. And I remember the next weekend when I was, the church had navigated a lot of changes. Maybe some of it had been hard for people and stuff. I remember standing up in front of the church. I was holding that bullet and I said, hey, I know some of the things we've navigated in recent years, some taking some of you out of your comfort zone, but I just want you to know you're making a difference. And, here's a life that has been saved because of your willingness to flex and to bend. And I just want to say to church leaders, you're making a difference. And sometimes it feels slow. Sometimes, you wonder if it's making any difference over time. But I guarantee you, there's a young guy out there. There's a young gal out there, an older guy, an older gal out there. You're making a difference in their lives. And what a privilege that, with the short time that we have on this earth, that God gives us the opportunity to minister to people and help them get ready for their last day on this planet and to live every day between now and then in his power and grace.
Amen. And what you said earlier, what happened to your dad will happen to all of us someday. And I just want you to know, Gene, that your life will help all of us get ready for whatever that last day is. Hopefully, we'll have some more years of service, but if not, we're ready for that day, and we've fought the good fight and we've finished the race. Thank you for your intentionality, your humility, for your faithfulness, and for the joy that you bring to ministry.
Well, back at you, friend, and I'm just grateful to have a 3-decade friendship with you, and no one will know, they know Dave Stone as a public person, but I know the private person, and I thank you for being who you are and how you've reached out to me in some of the lowest moments of life. You and Beth have cared for Barbara and I, and we're forever grateful.
Love you, buddy.
Love you.
Like always, I have so many different notes written down from these conversations. How about that story of Gene talking about his father passing away from that heart attack, and how in that moment he really felt compelled that he wanted to prepare other people for their last day on earth. Well, that was gripping to me. And when he talked about change and how churches need to semi-reinvent themselves every 5 years and dramatically reinvent themselves every 10 to 15 years. That's a good word for all of us to hear. It's not radical change every few years. Instead, it's just constantly and consistently tweaking things just a little bit. And then at times that full reorganization or that full change. Another great part for all of us was when he talked about paying attention to the interior world and not just the exterior world. That's where we typically see the breakdown happening, is in our interior world. And when he talked about that number of saying only 1 in 3 pastors finish well, I don't know about you, but that's frightening to me. And it's a wake-up call that we all need to make certain that we're shoring up that interior world. And then one of the last things that really hit me was just his passion and his heart for lost people. And we can argue whether or not that's the gift of evangelism or not. But I could tell you so many stories of Gene reaching out to people wherever it is that he's living, whether it's in his neighborhood, whether it's in the city, the people that he interfaces with and interacts with. He's being a light for the gospel. And it's not just in the pulpit where he preaches, but instead it's in everyday life. And he just loves on people. And his example that he shared of Vegas, I think so many times we realize that in our lives, God shines the brightest where it is the darkest. And so don't shy away from some of the people in your neighborhood who maybe you say, oh, they would never come to Christ. They would never come to Christ. Oh, please don't say that, because God will not allow their history to determine their destiny. Our God is not I was. Our God is I am. And he's living and he's active in this present world. Well, playing off of the talk that we had about evangelism and really how it is that within the church and as Christian leaders, we need to be sharing our faith. Sometimes we're drawn to the dramatic stories, and Gene shared some pretty dramatic ones of what God was doing around his neighborhood at Las Vegas. But let me just tell you a simple story that you can see happening that could happen right where you are. And sometimes I think it's those simple stories that really have the most impact because it's ones that we can relate to. I have a friend in ministry, Brock Odell, and Brock is a student pastor, and he is literally reaching hundreds of students and teens with the gospel. But he would tell you that his story began because of a young babysitter who was living on mission for Jesus. Brock says, when I was 7, my mom and my stepdad moved to a neighborhood in Illinois. They weren't following Jesus, but they wanted to start going on date nights. And so they began looking for a babysitter. Enter into the picture Jenny. Jenny was a trustworthy 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a local pastor. My parents didn't really care about her faith, just that she was trustworthy. And so while they would go out on dates, Jenny would watch my siblings and me. And Jenny, who liked to read, noticed all the self-help books around our house, titles about the universe is love and books like that. And of course, Jenny wasn't seminary trained or a church staff member, but she desperately wanted to talk to my mom about Jesus. And so she came up with a very creative idea. And since both of them loved to read, she kind of suggested a book club to my mom of just the two of them. And she said to my mom, hey, I'll read one of your books if you will read one of my books. And she agreed. And Jenny handed my mom a book written by Lee Strobel called The Case for Christ. And it's basically his story of going from being an atheist to becoming a bold follower of Jesus Christ. And Brock writes, fast forward a few months. After reading that book, my mom attended an Easter service at Jenny's church, and that day she surrendered her life to Jesus. Several months later, my dad did the same. And that changed my family forever. Our family tree changed, transformed, not because of a pastor or because of some big event, but because of a 13-year-old babysitter who shared Jesus the best way she knew how. You see, it doesn't have to be a dramatic story for it to motivate your church to share their faith with others. I'm just a nobody trying to tell everybody about somebody who can save anybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we appreciate you being a part of our Pastor to Pastor family. You know that we drop a brand new episode every Tuesday. It's designed to encourage, inspire, and to challenge you. And leadership can be lonely. And that's why we call this Pastor to Pastor. It's for a reason. It's to remind you that you're not alone. So until next time, I'm Dave Stone saying, God bless.